Did you just get out of prison?
Can you tone it down? This is a workplace.
Oh, sorry. I thought ideas were welcome here. That's the point. I'm not here to blend. I'm here to build.
That morning I felt confident, like walk into a room and don't it confident. I had just spent the weekend at my cousin's house. She does hair for a living and basically turns heads for sport. We tried something bold. Braids, color, a little swirl of rebellion, nothing wild, just something that finally felt like me. When I looked in the mirror, I smiled. When I walked into work, Karen did not smile, you know the type, corporate. Beige, middle-aged, probably voted most likely to snitch to HR in high school. She saw me from across the room, tilted her head, blinked once. 10 minutes later, ding, email from Karen, see me in my office. I thought she was gonna say something awkward but manageable like, new look, huh? Instead, she touched my braid, looked dead in my eyes and said, I kid you not, did you just get out of prison? Yup, all because of my hair. This is not just a story about a rude comment or one bad boss. This is about what happens when conformity meets culture, when identity walks into a cubicle and someone decides that's a problem. Over the next hour, I'm gonna take you through the emails, the HR meetings, the behind-the-back whispers, the viral TikTok, the lawsuit, and the one unexpected message that changed everything. We'll talk about how companies say diversity, but often mean as long as it looks like everyone else. We'll meet some silent allies, a few loud Karens, and a whole lot of policy double standards. And yes, there will be a twist. Several, actually. But let's start with a simple question. Have you ever been told to tone yourself down just to make someone else feel more comfortable? If the answer's yes, or even maybe, then this story is for you. And if you've ever had a Karen moment, hey, we're not judging. Stick around, you might learn something too. By the end of this video, you might just see that what seems unprofessional is often just undervalued. Drop a comment if you've ever had to shrink yourself to fit into a place that wasn't built for you. Or if you've ever worn a hairstyle that made someone uncomfortable, in the best way possible. I'd love to hear about it. Let's talk hair power and the right to just show up as you. Nice and vague. But if you dig a little deeper, what they really mean is, look like the majority, talk like the majority, style yourself like the majority, otherwise you're a distraction. In my case, my new braids apparently qualified as a professional emergency. It's wild how much power is hidden in phrases like clean cut or neatly groomed. Because those words, they don't describe everyone equally. They describe a default built for straight, flat, flowy hair that never questions the wind. A default that quietly screams, don't bring too much culture to work. I remember once a black coworker wore her natural curls out on a Monday. Gorgeous, bouncy, full of life. By Wednesday, someone from management had politely suggested she try a bun next time because her hair was too big for the space. As if volume is a violation. But here's the kicker, there was a white guy on the same floor. He dyed his hair platinum, shaved the sides, and left a mohawk so spiky it could puncture drywall. People loved it. Called him edgy, creative, punk rock. Nobody sent him to HR, and that's when it clicked for me. This isn't about hair being distracting. It's about whose hair they find acceptable and whose they don't. That's why the Crown Act was created. You may not have heard of it, but it's the law in several US states now. Crown stands for creating a respectful and open world for natural hair. It exists because Black people, especially women, were getting fired, suspended, or reassigned just for wearing locks, twists, or afros to work. Literal lawsuits, because someone dared to show up in the hair they were born with. Let that sink in. But laws don't automatically fix office culture. They just draw a line in the sand and hope HR reads it. At my job, when I started getting those passive-aggressive glances and whispered comments, a few coworkers reached out quietly. I love your hair, someone whispered by the copy machine. You're so brave, said another with the tone of someone complimenting a skydiver. Sweet, sure, but supportive, not exactly. Because when it came time to back me up in meetings or speak up when Karen crossed a line, silence. I don't blame them. Not entirely. Most people are just trying to keep their heads down and make it to Friday. But silence has a cost. And when enough people choose to stay quiet, the loudest voice in the room gets to define what's normal. And Karen, she was very loud. Here's a moment I won't forget. One of the younger guys in marketing, cool, white Spotify hoodie vibe, came in with neon green highlights. Karen saw him, laughed, and said, wow, you're brave, you look like you just stepped out of Coachella. To me, she said I looked angry. To him, she said he looked innovative. Same workplace, different rulebook. That's when the office stopped feeling like a job and started feeling like a battleground. And let me tell you, it's exhausting to feel like you're defending your existence every time you walk through a door. Not because you're loud, not because you're late, but because you exist boldly, visibly, unapologetically. I used to think being professional meant wearing the right blazer and answering emails on time. Now I know, for some of us, just being ourselves is seen as unprofessional. That's a lesson they don't teach you in college. But here's what they also don't teach you: you're not alone, and you're not wrong for choosing to take up space. Which brings us to what happened when I was finally told, flat out, that I'd either change my look or change my job. Spoiler alert, I didn't cut my hair, but I did cut the silence. Let me show you what happened next. I was mid-bite into a sad little desk salad, half-wilted lettuce, questionable tuna when the calendar invite popped up. Meeting with Karen, immediate, HR will attend. No subject line, no context, just that. I blinked at the screen. It was 7 p.m. I had been in the office for less than 5 hours that day. Apparently my hair had already caused a full-blown crisis. The meeting took place in one of those sterile glass conference rooms that smell like anxiety and old expo markers. Karen was already seated, arms crossed, HR rep next to her with a legal pad she never once wrote on. I sat down, tried to breathe normal. Karen cleared her throat like she was auditioning for the role of disappointed mother. Then she launched in, "We need to talk about your appearance." Now I've been black long enough to know where that sentence usually leads. Still, I gave her the benefit of the doubt for about 5 seconds. "This is a professional environment," she continued. "Your hairstyle sends the wrong message." I blinked twice, because what message could braids possibly send? Besides, I spent 6 hours in a chair on Sunday. I looked her right in the eye and asked, "What message exactly?" She opened her mouth, closed it, and did this thing with her lips like she was chewing invisible food. She couldn't answer, because there was no real answer, just discomfort wrapped in corporate language. The HR rep, still silent, still holding that untouched legal pad, shifted in her seat like she wanted to disappear into the potted plant behind her. Karen pressed on. "We've had clients on site lately, and we want to maintain a consistent, polished image. I'm giving you the option to adjust your look." She used the word adjust like she was talking about changing a font, not someone's cultural identity. Then came the solution part. "You can either modify your hairstyle to align with company expectations, or we'll need to transition you to a non-client facing role. That's corporate speak for, cut your hair or we'll hide you behind a desk where no one can see you." The words hit me hard, not because I hadn't seen it coming, but because hearing it out loud, it made it real. It made it official. I wasn't just being paranoid, I wasn't overreacting. This was about control, about power. I sat there letting the silence stretch. They say silence is uncomfortable, not for me. I let it sit until Karen started shifting in her seat. Then I spoke. "My hair isn't the problem, you are." And the room went still, the kind of still that buzzes in your ears, the kind where even the air seems to hold its breath. HR finally moved, flipping the blank notepad closed like that counted as documentation. Karen said nothing, because what could she say? I stood up, told them I'd be happy to meet again when they had something lawful to discuss. And I walked out. That was the moment I realized something big. Up until then, I'd tried to be polite, reasonable, professional, but sometimes professionalism becomes a leash, and the only way to loosen it is to speak up. Loudly, clearly, unapologetically. I won't lie, it was terrifying. I walked back to my desk with my heart in my throat, half expecting security to be waiting with a cardboard box, but nothing happened, at least not immediately. That's the thing about corporate retaliation, it doesn't always come all at once. Sometimes it simmers quietly until it explodes. What came next wasn't loud, but it was calculated. Subtle slights, missed memos. A sudden performance review. The quiet kind of pressure designed to make you fold. But I wasn't planning to fold, because something had shifted. Not in them, in me. And that shift, that was the beginning of a much bigger fight. One that involved TikTok, the Crown Act, a surprising group of allies, and a message that reached far beyond my office walls. Let's talk about what really happens when HR pretends to play fair, but isn't even holding a pen. Before this all started, I used to think HR was the grown-up in the room, the mediator, the one you called when things got unfair or uncomfortable. I thought HR was like the office version of a referee, neutral, fair, clipboard in hand, blowing the whistle when someone crossed the line. I was wrong. Because in most companies, especially the big, glossy, people-first ones, HR doesn't work for the people. HR works for the company, period. I learned that the hard way. After the Karen ultimatum, I went to HR trying to make sense of what had just happened. I told them how uncomfortable the meeting was, how my hairstyle was singled out, how it felt like I was being punished for simply existing as myself. The HR rep nodded like she was listening, wrote a few things down, then said with the flattest tone I've ever heard, "We'll take it under consideration." Now, I don't know if you've ever been under consideration, but it's basically the corporate version of putting your complaint in a folder labeled ignore. No follow-up, no timeline, no transparency. Just a vague smile and a promise that your voice matters. Meanwhile, things around me started to shift, subtly, strategically. At first, it was little stuff, getting left off email chains, not being looped into projects I normally led. Then came the micromanagement. I started noticing that someone from upper management was randomly checking in on me more than usual. My lunch breaks were suddenly too long. My tone in meetings was suddenly too direct. My output was acceptable but lacks polish. It was like I was starring in a reality show called How to Build a Case for Termination Without Actually Saying It. I started keeping notes, dates, times, comments, because I could feel it. They weren't just ignoring my complaint, they were preparing for their defense. That's when I fell into a research rabbit hole. Did you know studies show that Black employees are significantly more likely to receive subjective, negative feedback in performance reviews? Words like unapproachable, aggressive, difficult to work with, all soft-sounding but lethal when written down. One Harvard Business Review article even called it performance review bias, a quiet but powerful form of workplace discrimination that's almost impossible to challenge because it hides behind opinion. You don't need proof of failure, you just need enough doubt. And let's be real, when HR wants you out, they don't need a smoking gun, they just need to say, "This employee has become a disruption." I realized something else too. People always say speak up, like it's this easy act of bravery, but what they don't tell you is what comes after you speak up. The silence, the side eyes, the slow unraveling of your place in a system that only ever worked for you when you stayed quiet. That was the part that got me the most. Not the outright bias, but the quiet betrayal. The way people around you start to treat you like you're radioactive, like speaking up somehow made you the problem. Like professionalism only applies when you're compliant. So here's the question I found myself asking. If your workplace only supports you when you're silent, is it really a safe place? Because a safe space doesn't mean no conflict. It means you can tell the truth and still have a seat at the table the next day. At that point, I knew I couldn't go back to normal. Not when every hallway felt like a warning sign and every quick check-in felt like a setup. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't have predicted, was how this story would stop being mine alone. Because something happened that I didn't expect, a DM, then another, then a dozen, stories, screenshots, emails. Turns out I wasn't the first person Karen had tried to shrink. I was just the first one who said no out loud. And that was the beginning of something way bigger than HR's file cabinet. Let's talk about the whispers behind closed doors, and how solidarity often starts with one person saying, "Me too." It started with a Slack message. I was sitting at my desk, pretending to read a report but mostly replaying that awful HR meeting in my head when the notification popped up. From someone I didn't talk to much, let's call her Danny. Always polite, always quiet, always sipping peppermint tea like she was trying to disappear. Her message just said, "Hey, what she did to you, she did it to me last year too." I stared at the screen, read it 3 times, and suddenly I wasn't alone anymore. Danny told me how Karen once cornered her after a team meeting and asked, "Are you sure that outfit's appropriate for your body type?" Just loud enough for other people to hear but soft enough to deny if needed. Another day, she accidentally mispronounced Danny's name after working together for 8 months. Same Karen, different weapon, that message cracked something open. Over the next week, more messages started trickling in. From people I knew, from people I barely noticed. Each one started with some version of, "I didn't want to say anything but." Apparently, Karen had a whole catalog of microaggressions. Too colorful, too casual, too opinionated, too emotional. She didn't like accents that didn't sound like hers. She once told a Latina coworker that her perfume was distracting and made the office smell like a nightclub. She liked things muted, safe, familiar, and anyone who didn't fit that template, she slowly edged them out, one concerned comment at a time. It wasn't a policy, it was a pattern. one that only becomes visible when you zoom out and start comparing stories. That's when I decided to create a group chat. It started as a joke. I called it Unfiltered Fridays, just a space to vent, swap stories, and maybe survive the week with our dignity intact. At first, it was just 4 of us, then 6. By the end of the month, we had 15 people across departments, backgrounds, and job titles. We shared what had been said to us, what had been done to us, how we'd felt ashamed, confused, isolated. And in that little digital corner of the internet, we did something most of us hadn't done at work in a long time. We laughed. Not because any of it was funny, but because, for once, we weren't the only ones carrying the weight. There's something healing about hearing, same here. It doesn't fix everything, but it gives you a place to stand. It also made something very clear. People don't stay quiet because they don't care. They stay quiet because they're scared. Scared of losing their job, scared of being labeled difficult, scared of being the one person who raises their hand and then gets left alone in the spotlight. But when one person speaks up, others start whispering, then talking, then organizing. It's not rebellion, it's recognition. One message I got hit me hard. It was from a former employee, someone who had left the company before I even joined. They wrote, "I wish I had your courage. Maybe I'd still be there." That message stayed with me because it wasn't really about me being brave. It was about what happens when people aren't believed, when the first domino falls but no one notices. Karen didn't invent this kind of behavior, but she was skilled at exploiting a system that rewarded silence and punished difference. And most of the time, she got away with it. Because the people she targeted left quietly or stayed quietly. Until now, this wasn't just about hair anymore. It was about a culture that makes people question if they're the problem just for being themselves. Unfiltered Fridays gave us a little space to breathe, but outside that chat, nothing had changed. Karen still sat in her glass office. HR still hadn't followed up. And I still showed up every day feeling like I was walking a tightrope in heels. That's when I realized talking among ourselves wasn't enough. We needed to talk to the world. And so, I did what every frustrated millennial does when the system fails them. I opened TikTok. Let's talk about what happens when the internet gets a front row seat to office politics, and why sometimes the loudest voice wins. I wasn't trying to go viral. Honestly, I was just venting. It was late. I was in bed with my bonnet on, scrolling TikTok to distract myself from the chaos that had become my 9 to 5. Somebody was lip-syncing Megan Thee Stallion. Another was deep into a recipe for crockpot mac and cheese. And then somewhere between my frustration and a leftover sugar crash, I opened the camera. I didn't name names. I didn't name the company. No logos, no gossip, no receipts. Just me sitting in dim lighting, explaining calmly, clearly, and with a side of humor how my hair had become a compliance issue. I called it the time my braids almost got me demoted. I hit post, figured 200 people might watch it. Maybe a few would nod in solidarity, and that would be it. It was. By the time I brushed my teeth the next morning, the video had 30,000 views. By lunch, it hit 100K. By dinner, I was at 500,000 and climbing. The comments were the wildest part. This happened to me at Macy's. In 2016, I still think about it. Why is hair still a thing in the 2020s? Sis, you're speaking for all of us, don't stop. It was like I'd touched a nerve, or maybe opened a pressure valve. People started sharing their own stories, being told to tone it down, act more professional, or lose the hoops. It wasn't just about hair, it was about identity, visibility, dignity, and it was clear I wasn't alone. That's the funny thing about the internet. It doesn't just echo, it amplifies. And once your story is out there, it's no longer just yours. Back at the office, things got tense. Karen found out about the video. I don't know who showed her. Maybe someone who thought they were being helpful. All I know is she stormed out of her office mid-afternoon, red in the face, clutching her phone like it had personally betrayed her. Within the hour, I was called into a follow-up HR meeting. No one said the word TikTok, but it hung in the air like perfume. They asked vague questions about external communications and professional conduct. Karen wanted to know if I was planning to post another video. HR wanted to remind me of the company's social media policy. I wanted to ask, does the policy say anything about microaggressions or just lighting angles? But I bit my tongue for the moment. Behind the scenes, Karen wasn't just angry, she was panicked. I heard she called legal, demanded an internal review, even threatened a defamation suit against a video that never said her name. What she didn't realize was, when the truth resonates, it doesn't need a name. People recognize the pattern, and then it happened. I got a DM from a verified account I didn't recognize, a reporter from HuffPost. She said she'd seen the video, loved the message, and wanted to talk on the record. My first instinct was to say no. I mean, I wasn't a whistleblower, I didn't have a movement. I was just tired. Tired of being policed for looking like myself. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized this was bigger than me. It always had been. I called Danny, remember her from the Unfiltered Fridays chat. Well, she said, if they're gonna tell your story anyway, make sure they hear it from you. So I agreed to the interview, not because I wanted attention, but because I was done letting fear decide what I said out loud. And here's the thing. When you stop whispering, other people start listening. And when enough people listen, change becomes possible. What started as a throwaway video in my pajamas had become a conversation across cities, industries, even states. People weren't just watching, they were rethinking. That's the power of storytelling, not to shame, but to shift. And if Karen thought that video rattled her, she hadn't seen what came next. Because the company, they didn't want a lawsuit. They wanted silence. They wanted me to take the video down. They offered a meeting with upper management, a chance to clear the air. But I had other plans. Let's talk about what happens when a corporation would rather change you than change itself, and why that's exactly when you bring in the lawyers. About a week after the video went viral, things started to get performative. First came the email blast. Subject line, our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. It had the usual corporate buzzwords, safe space, open dialogue, respectful culture. The kind of email you read 3 times and still don't know what it actually says. Then came the flyers. Printed on glossy paper, taped up in the break room, Diversity Week is coming. There was going to be a panel on being your authentic self at work, a potluck celebrating global flavors, a workshop titled Hair and Identity. Let's talk about it. Taught by a white woman from accounting. I wish I were kidding. Meanwhile, back at my desk, my inbox was oddly quiet. No apology, no check-in, no follow-up on the complaint I filed with HR weeks ago. Just passive-aggressive silence wrapped in colorful clip art. And then one afternoon, I got called into yet another meeting. This time, it wasn't a check-in, it was a formal notice. The company had decided to place me on administrative suspension, effective immediately. The reason? Creating disruption in the workplace and violating internal communications policy. They didn't say TikTok, but they didn't have to. It was clear. They weren't fixing the problem. They were fixing me. I remember sitting there staring at the paper they handed me thinking, so I'm the problem now, not the bias, not the pattern, not the silence, me. That's when I stopped feeling angry and started feeling dangerous. Because once you see the game, it's hard to pretend you don't know the rules. The truth is, corporate America is great at virtue signaling. You know, when companies perform diversity instead of practicing it, they post black squares on Instagram, they sponsor pride parades, they add a DEI tab to their website somewhere under careers. But when someone inside actually speaks up, they get iced out, written up, and quietly pushed out. It's not about protecting values, it's about protecting image, and they were clearly more interested in PR than in people. Now here's the kicker. While I was at home, technically still employed but suspended, I started digging. I searched lawsuits, old press releases, employee reviews, and guess what I found? This wasn't the company's first dance with discrimination complaints. 2 years ago, a former employee had filed a claim, also about appearance-based bias, also ignored. The case had been settled quietly, buried in arbitration, with a mutual NDA and a severance check. No wonder HR looked like they'd seen a ghost when I mentioned legal action. They'd been down this road before and swept it under the rug. That's when I realized this wasn't about me at all. I was just a liability they didn't anticipate, a story they couldn't control, and that's when I made my decision. I called a lawyer, not the friend of a friend kind, not someone to review the policy. I mean real legal representation. Someone who understood employment law, civil rights, and exactly how many ways a company can try to silence someone who tells the truth. When we met, I brought everything, the emails, the Slack messages, the video metrics, screenshots of the group chat, that glossy Diversity Week flyer they thought would make it all go away. The lawyer looked at it all, then looked at me and said, "Oh, they messed with the wrong one." And for the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Power. Because when you know your rights and you know your story and you've got a team behind you, they can call it disruption. You can call it momentum. I wasn't just telling my truth anymore. I was about to defend it. Let's talk about what happens when the law steps into the break room and what it really means to fight back with receipts. I didn't grow up dreaming of suing my employer. But then again, I didn't grow up thinking my hair would almost cost me my job. By this point, I wasn't angry, I was strategic. The TikTok had already done its job, the story was out, the public was watching, and the company, they were squirming. I connected with a nonprofit that specializes in workplace discrimination cases, particularly those involving cultural identity. They didn't blink when I explained what happened. Didn't ask if I had maybe misinterpreted the situation. They just said, "We've seen this before, you're not alone." The lawyer they assigned me was sharp, calm, and didn't waste words. She took one look at my notes, pulled out a folder, and said, "We'll build this under the Crown Act. Now, if you're not familiar, let me break it down. The Crown Act stands for creating a respectful and open world for natural hair. It's a law already passed in multiple states that prohibits discrimination based on hairstyles historically associated with race, particularly Black identity. Braids, locks, twists, afros, all protected. Because guess what? Your hair isn't just hair, it's culture, it's history, it's you. So, with the Crown Act in one hand and my HR folder in the other, we filed the lawsuit. Not just for wrongful suspension, not just for hostile work environment, but for cultural discrimination, clear, documented, and repeated. And oh boy, that got their attention. The company's response was fast and predictable. They didn't want a trial, they wanted it quiet. Their lawyer called mine. Offered a settlement, 5 figures, and a non-disclosure agreement. In exchange, I'd drop the case, take the money, and pretend like none of it ever happened. Tempting, sure, easy, definitely, but silence isn't always safety. And a payout doesn't fix the problem. It just pays you not to talk about it. I said no, because I wasn't just doing this for me anymore. I was doing it for everyone who'd been told their natural self was unprofessional. For every person who'd spent their Sunday undoing themselves to survive Monday. The case went forward, and slowly things started to shift. Discovery unearthed old complaints, some eerily similar to mine. Emails surfaced that HR had never intended for outside eyes. That shiny Diversity Week flyer? Yeah, the lawyer loved that. Eventually, the company folded, not with an apology but with a settlement on my terms. I got compensation. More importantly, I got policy change. They agreed to revise their dress code language, include anti-bias training with real accountability, and publicly affirm their compliance with the Crown Act. And Karen got relocated. That's corporate for you got caught, but we don't want a headline. They said she was being transferred to a regional office to explore leadership opportunities. But everyone knew she was being quietly escorted out the back door. No goodbye cake, no team lunch, just a company-wide email with her name misspelled in the subject line. It wasn't revenge, it was consequence, and it mattered. Because when companies are forced to act, not just perform, it sends a message. Not just to employees, but to executives, to HR, to every Karen quietly taking notes behind a desk. This whole journey taught me something simple but powerful. Policies only matter when someone's brave enough to challenge them. If I'd taken the first offer, if I'd stayed quiet, the company would have chalked me up as another disgruntled employee and moved on. But because I did, they couldn't, and here's what surprised me most. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired, but I also felt seen, like for once I hadn't had to shrink to fit in, I got to take up space. Legally. The fight wasn't over, but something shifted. Now people in the office actually talked about the Crown Act. Someone wore twists to a client meeting. HR quietly updated their bias training slide deck, tiny changes. But changes nonetheless. And while the battle had taken a toll, it also gave me something back, choice. Let's talk about what happens after the victory, how finding your voice changes the way you move through the world, and why real power isn't just about being right, it's about refusing to be erased. And I get it. If you've never been told your natural self is unprofessional, if no one's ever suggested you change your texture, your shade, your curls, your coils, just to keep your job, then yeah, hair might seem like a small thing. But here's what I've learned, hair is never just hair. In so many cultures, it's history. For Black communities, hair has been protest, survival, and art, sometimes all at once. Cornrows once carried escape routes for enslaved people. Afros became a symbol of Black pride and power during the Civil Rights Movement. Locks, braids, twists, each style carries a story, a lineage, a statement that says, "I exist on my terms." For Native American communities, hair is sacred. To cut it can symbolize grief or spiritual transition. To touch it without permission is a violation. And in LGBTQ plus spaces, hair can be a declaration of identity. A buzz cut after coming out, a bold color as a flag of freedom, an undercut, a fade, a sharp line that says, I'm here, I'm me. But somewhere along the way, corporate culture decided that visibility was a risk. That difference was a distraction. And so it created this idea of professionalism, which, let's be honest, was really just a polished version of whiteness. Straight hair, neutral tones, quiet lips, no big hoops. Blend in, don't stand out. Don't bring your whole self, just the parts that don't make people uncomfortable. That's why my braids felt like such a big deal. Not because they were flashy or loud, but because they didn't ask for permission. They took up space in a system built to erase people like me in subtle, polite ways. And listen, I've worked in places where that wasn't the case, where creativity wasn't just allowed, it was expected. I once interviewed at a tech startup where the CEO wore a hoodie and nose ring, and the receptionist had lavender hair with glitter roots. Nobody clutched their pearls. Nobody sent HR an email. It wasn't chaos, it was freedom. Because when people get to show up as themselves, they bring more than just their skills. They bring their joy, their authenticity, their best ideas, and that's not just good for morale, it's good for business. But for that to happen, companies have to stop treating identity like a risk. And that starts with unlearning the idea that professional means invisible. Because I've sat in meetings with women wearing 4-inch heels and full lashes, running million-dollar accounts. I've seen men with dreads and gold grills close deals that changed whole departments. And guess what? Nobody's productivity suffered because someone had a fade or a twist out. The real distraction isn't hair, it's bias. The kind that whispers, she looks too urban. Or he's not polished enough. Or she should tone that down. What they're really saying is, I don't know how to relate to you and that makes me uncomfortable. But that's not our burden to carry, not anymore. Because sometimes the journey to reclaim your voice doesn't start with a protest or a podium. It starts with a single decision, to wear your hair the way it naturally grows. To show up in a space that wasn't built for you and choose not to shrink. That's what this whole experience taught me. The first time I wore braids to work, I thought I was just switching up my look. Turns out I was redefining the rules. And while I didn't set out to make a statement, I did because I finally realized what they called unprofessional was actually just unapologetic. Let's talk about what happens when you take back that power and why the stories we tell about ourselves can change more than just policies. They can change culture. If you've made it this far, thank you. This story started with braids, but it became about something so much bigger. It became about power, who has it, who abuses it, and who's expected to stay quiet. It became about identity. And what happens when that identity doesn't fit into someone else's idea of professional? It became about systems, about silence, about standing your ground even when the room goes cold. Along the way, I learned that HR doesn't always protect you, that corporate diversity statements don't always mean action, that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is be visible. But the truth is, this wasn't just my story, because the moment I spoke up, the floodgates opened. People shared their own moments being told to straighten their curls, to tone down their voice, to change their accent, their wardrobe, their name just to fit in. Moments that made them feel small, out of place, or just plain exhausted. So now it's your turn. If you've ever been told your natural self was too much, too bold, too loud, too different, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment and write, that was me too. That's it, 3 little words, but they carry a whole world of truth. And maybe, just maybe, those words will help someone else feel a little less alone. If you're not ready to share publicly, there's a link in the description where you can send your story anonymously. We're building something here, a community. And your voice, it matters. Not every story will go viral. Not every fight will end in a lawsuit. But every time you choose to speak, you shift the balance just a little. And if there's one thing I hope you take away from all this, it's this: they tried to erase me, but all they did was highlight me. So wear the hair, speak in your accent, show up with your whole self. You don't have to shrink to survive. You don't have to soften to succeed. You just have to be you and trust that's enough, because it is. And if you've got a story to tell, I'm listening. In fact, this won't be the last video. We're working on a whole series featuring real people, real stories, and the everyday courage it takes to simply exist with pride in spaces that weren't built for us. So if you want to be part of that, subscribe, follow, share this with someone who needs to know they're not alone. Your story matters. Let them hear it, I promise. We're just getting started.